as I dive into the history and research behind standardized testing. I'm Dr. Emily Sherwood. If you're interested in education policy and global education, please like and subscribe. So it's that time of year again. Children all over the country will begin to take tests. Some of them have already started in the last week or two. And I know here in South Carolina, most of them will take the test in the next couple of weeks. Up north, it may take a little bit longer because those schools usually get out a little bit later. So some of those students might be taking their test in June. But no matter where your child lives, if they live in the United States, odds are your child is taking a test soon, or has just taken a test this spring. Because standardized testing in the United States is something that is more or less universal. All schools in the United States are required to test in grades 3 through 8 in math and reading, and in most places in the United States, most states in the United States, there's also tests for science and social studies. When the children get to high school, there are standardized tests for their particular courses, and in some states like New York, there's also tests to graduate. So standardized testing in the United States is bigger than arguably anywhere in the world. Here in South Carolina, students take at least 3 to 4 tests a year once they're past the second grade. And that doesn't include the tests that are teacher or district mandated. So I talked about universal screeners in a previous video. That does not include that. And even kindergartners, for example, will take a reading readiness test, which is a standardized test in the United States. And these tests are not just your regular tests. When we talk about standardized tests, that means that everyone takes the same test. And they're very, very strict about the conditions for the test. For example, here in South Carolina, when students take a standardized test, when they take what's called the SC Ready, which is the main standardized test that students take in upper elementary and middle school, the teacher actually has to do a seating chart, because the state actually looks at the seating chart. If students perform similarly in their answers, then they look at that and they determine if the students have been cheating, which sounds pretty extreme when we're talking about students in elementary and middle school, but that's a big concern. Students also cannot go to the bathroom by themselves during the test. If they have to go to the bathroom, a teacher has to be watching in the hallway to make sure that the students don't cheat, and only one person can go in the bathroom at a time. So testing in the United States is extremely stressful, and a lot of people don't know just kind of how this came about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history. So there were actually mandated written exams even before the Civil War in the United States. So exams that would show what a student was doing. But it wasn't till about 1900 that there started being what you might call standardized tests that measure achievement, really large, extensive tests. And it really got started in World War I more, because there were a lot of mental tests for soldiers to see if they were fit to fight and what they were good at. And by 1918, there were over 100 standardized tests in the United States. And as early as 1922, there was some controversy over tests about whether this was a good thing to measure knowledge, to measure intelligence. And in 1926, the Standardized Aptitude Test, or the SAT, was the first large-scale college exam. And by 1936, many states adopted the Iowa Assessment Test. And these were the first tests that you might consider standardized tests that were included to every student in every grade. And it actually didn't become mainstream in the United States to have standardized tests until about the mid-1960s. 1950s and 1960s. My grandmother began teaching in the early 1950s, and she actually remembers when the first time that she gave a standardized test, and I believe it was sometime in the mid-1960s. And at that time, it wasn't really a big deal. She said that they just took the test, everybody took the same test, it just took one morning, it was a pretty short test, and it was sent off to the state of, the results were sent to the state of South Carolina, but it wasn't a big deal. They didn't really do anything with it. And that began to change in the 1990s and the 2000s. So in 1981, Ronald Reagan issued A Nation at Risk, was a report that kind of led to the whole education reform movement. This idea that schools were failing in the United States and that they needed to be reformed so that we could compete with Russia, particularly Soviet Union at that time, that we needed to compete with them with technology and with intelligence and production. And that idea kind of spurred the whole idea of standardized testing and school accountability, the idea that schools needed to be held accountable for students, and that schools could be measured, and that schools should be responsible for students' learning. So it just got bigger and bigger, and in 2001, No Child Left Behind was a law put by the Bush administration, and that really kind of raised the stakes for standardized testing. It was already a thing, but it kind of made it much more punitive. That means that schools could really get in trouble if students didn't do well on the test. And it also determined that test scores are entirely public. So now, if you have a child in the United States, at any school in the United States, it doesn't matter where, you can see your child's school's test scores. And in South Carolina, they call this a report card, your school's report card. In other places, it's called different things. But your school is actually scored based on how your students do. And it could be like a grade letter scale, like Tennessee. They give an A, B, C, D of how the schools are doing in certain areas, or it could be more subjective to that. Like here in South Carolina, it's satisfactory and below average, good, and excellent. And it gives, but all the schools are judged by this, and sometimes the stakes are really, really high for schools. There are many schools who face what's called a turnaround process. It started in North Carolina, where I lived growing up in the 1990s, where if the schools did really poorly year after year on these tests, the state would come in and they would pretty much fire all the administration, the principals, and the main staff, and they would put in all these rules to try to help the school and try to turn the school around. So tests are super, super stressful for students in the United States. There's so much pressure for the school to do well, and there's actually been scandals. The big one was in Atlanta a few years ago, where teachers were cheating because they needed good test scores. There's also, kind of anecdotally, there's been a lot of reports that students are being retained. That means they're staying a second year to artificially inflate these test scores. And it's a lot of pressure on schools and on teachers. And if a teacher has poor test scores, that could also reflect badly in their evaluations. And they may even not get tenure, which means that you're allowed to stay at the school. They may not get tenure because of that in some places. So there's just a lot of pressure and stress involved with testing. I've been in situations where students have passed out because they're so stressed. I've been in situations where students just really get frustrated with testing. There's just a lot of pressure and stress around testing. Does any of this help? Does it matter? There are people who are now arguing that it's a civil rights issue to have standardized tests, that we need to keep the test because otherwise schools will not be accountable, and they won't help the students to be the best they can. That the tests are kind of an incentive to have good education and to improve education when needed. But the Office of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which is a group of countries that could be considered developed or high income, did a study of countries around the world. And the OECD found that holding teachers accountable and schools accountable for student test scores did not help students, schools to be better. It didn't hurt them, but there wasn't a clear connection between having all these rules and all this accountability and schools doing well. It was not an incentive. And when you think about the huge amount of time that is spent with standardized testing and the preparation for standardized testing. Many times teachers will start preparing 3 weeks to a month in advance, and so students lose that whole time. English language test, sometimes it takes 4 to 6 weeks to test everyone, and during that time the teacher's testing so the students can't learn. When you think about all that time that's spent, and then all the money that's spent, the amount of money spent per student per test really varies based on the test, but it's usually somewhere between about $30 and $100, which doesn't sound like a lot, but then you think about how many students take these tests and how many tests there are in a year, and it adds up to billions of dollars that we're spending on testing. With that money could go to more teachers, to better curriculum, to services to help students. There are lots of things that money could go towards, and it's not. It's going towards testing. Also, the countries that do the best in the world, particularly in Asia, do not have very many standardized tests. China and Singapore, which Singapore is usually number 1 in the world, and China is usually in the top 5, depending on what we're measuring, only have 2 big tests of our students' entire school career. One is at the end of primary school when the child is going into middle school, and the test largely determines what middle school that child can go to. So even in public schools, there's often a form of school choice where students apply to go to these schools and they're accepted, and they may not be accepted, and they're largely accepted based on test scores. The schools are often specialized. For example, I had a friend who was looking at putting her child into a school for AI, for artificial intelligence, kind of a tech-focused school. And her child had to apply, and a big part of the admissions process was looking at the test scores, and that's largely how students were chosen. And the big test in China is called the Gaokao, and there's another form of it in Korea, where in the at the end of school, in what would be considered the 12th grade, students take a very large, very extensive test, and this test is taken extremely seriously. They actually stop traffic for this test in China, which I can't think of anybody stopping traffic for a test here, but it's considered so important, and the scores of the students is considered so important. Traffic actually stops so that students get to the testing site on time. And students in China do crazy things like sometimes they'll go to like a cram school right before the test, and they'll actually live at this school, and will just study for weeks on end. Students will have hired instructors and tutors, and it's just an extremely big deal. And that determines what college you'll be able to get into, the Gaokao. That's what it's called in China. Like I said, there's different forms in different parts of Asia. But those are the best in the world, and there's only 2 big tests. So why do we need tests every year, and why do they need to be so extensive and expensive and strict when other places don't do that and they get better results? So I believe that there needs to be an overhaul of the standardized testing system to something that works better for students. And that doesn't mean that we get rid of accountability all over. There are lots of ways to look at accountability. That includes growth, that includes student portfolios that show multiple pieces of data and how the student's improving. There are lots of ways that we can hold schools accountable, but not have this huge testing empire that stresses everyone out, burns teachers out, and is so expensive and takes up so much time. So that's my belief on it. So that's all for today. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep learning.